It's good to be with you. I still do some teaching, and it's so nice to be with an audience that actually remembers presidential elections prior to 2000. Actually, I see some members here who probably remember elections prior to 1952. But context is important. For so many of our younger voters, the world just began 10 years ago. And when you tell them that Hillary Clinton's spouse was president of the United States, there's not a great memory of that. If the kids are 18, 19, 20, I mean, that's a different era. So I'm delighted to be here. I know many of you, and I know, I'm not going to look at anybody in particular, Violet or Betty or whatever, but I know some of you will have questions at minute 5. And I think it's most fun when we have questions, and so you should feel free to ask a question at any point. And if I feel it's interrupting the flow of the conversation, I will use the old faculty member trick and say, we'll get to that later. That's a wonderful question or whatever. And I'm supposed to talk about Ohio, and I will, but obviously in this presidential cycle, there's so many questions that I know are on your mind. And let me just start with just one observation. And it's simply that, look, the odds of Donald Trump becoming president are equivalent, let's say, to the Cleveland Cavaliers coming back from a 3-1 deficit and winning Game 7 against the Golden State Warriors on their home court. Things like that just don't happen. So, well, good. I'm glad I've impressed some of you already. I might have overjoyed some of you, perhaps. But one of the things we'll get to later is that, in fact, the prospect of Donald Trump being our next president, I'd say it's 1 in 3. And 1 in 3 events happen. And Ohio will be a critical state in that, as will Pennsylvania. And we can talk in more detail. Let me just start talking about Ohio. We are, in Ohio, the quintessential battleground state. When I sent out my Christmas greetings to my friends in 2012, I said, greetings from Ohio, the home of the 2012 presidential election. And friends of mine who lived in Texas and California and New York, I just said to them, how do you like being irrelevant? Because you are, and you will be once again in this year. So what makes Ohio a battleground state? It's a competitive state. It's a large electoral college vote state. If you really look at the battleground states, it'll be places like Florida, where right now Hillary Clinton has a fairly substantial lead, in part because of the heavy Hispanic population that is so offended right now by the Trump candidacy. Ohio doesn't have a large Hispanic population, relatively small. Pennsylvania this year I think will be more of a battleground state. In fact, the Big Ten states, the Great Lakes states, those are sort of the battleground states. But Ohio really has, in the last number of election cycles, been that state. So let me just tell you, before telling you why, in 2012, Barack Obama kicked off his campaign on the Ohio State campus at the Schottenstein Center, which is our basketball arena. That was the official announcement of his campaign. He had multiple visits to Columbus and to the Ohio State campus. In fact, I was joking that not Ohio and not Franklin County, where we are now, but Ohio State was the heart of the presidential campaign. A little chauvinistic, but I say that because one day when I was teaching my honors class, I said, okay, we can get out a little early because the president is having a rally on the Oval. So you walk outside, and there you are at a huge rally. And the students began to believe, well, this happens all the time. You can just see the president and the presidential campaign firsthand. We got a call one day during the campaign And it was from the Obama campaign saying, the president wants to make a surprise visit to campus the next day. This is the height of the campaign. Secret Service hates that. White House advance doesn't like it that much either, but they said, we want to do this, and we're going to go to the student union. And you're not supposed to tell anybody. And we didn't. And we didn't. It was amazing how, of course, not very many of us knew, and a few of us swore ourselves to secrecy. But of course, those of us who knew went over to the Ohio Union, and around 11 o'clock, a motorcade pulls up on High Street, which of course blocks all traffic, and the President of the United States walks out of the limo, walks into the Ohio Union, and I'm looking at the students, looking at the president, and again, it's just an assortment of students, and the students are sort of saying, can't be. And then they see there are bodyguards and Secret Service, and then you can see some students starting to text, and then the president goes into the diner at the Ohio Union. It's called Sloopy's, and there are 3 students sitting in a booth, with the red leather, with all that, and there's a 4th spot there. So the president sits down with them. And, of course, by now, selfies and all of that. And, of course, the crowd is beginning to build because of social media. Students are texting all their friends. They're all flocking over. So now there's a couple of thousand people there. And what happens after 20 minutes, the president gets up and leaves. Because the real reason he was in Columbus was to visit Capital University. They had an announced rally down there. And after he left, there was this amazing... Now, did we just, really see this? Not to be too off, or were there bad mushrooms on our pizza or something? And of course, the publicity it got. Now, so when I sent out my Christmas newsletter in 2012, I said, we were so blessed in Ohio because we got to see more campaign commercials than just about any other state. I mean, Wisconsin had a lot, but we were just blessed. And we got more direct mail. I mean, the postman must have really loved us because he just kept on delivering this stuff. And, we had more, even old-fashioned newspaper advertising. It just went on. And of course, all these visits upset the routines of the city because they do block traffic. When the president flies into the airport, you have a motorcade from the airport. Anybody who's on I-670 coming into town, or they'll know that it's the President of the United States. So we were the heart of the campaign. And there were a few other states that played a very, very major role. But why is Ohio so significant? Well, part of it is that we are a relatively balanced state politically. We have a very diverse economic makeup in the state. Manufacturing has suffered major declines, but we still are a major manufacturing state. Our service economy, particularly in Columbus and Cleveland and Cincinnati, is beginning to grow quite a bit. We have a major agricultural economy in Ohio. And in southeastern Ohio, we have a major energy economy. And part of that economy is woefully on the decline. That's the coal industry. But fracking right now is actually going very, very well, and that's sort of a hope for the Appalachian region in terms of generating some wealth and jobs and things like that. So we have a very, very diverse economic base. We have a fairly diverse population with the exception of Hispanics. I think that's about 3% of our population. But our state is about 12% African American. It has white ethnic groups of every kind. It's got religious groups of every kind. And so it really is a balanced state. Now, if you look at it today, every one of our statewide elected office holders is a Republican. 12 of our 16 members of Congress are Republican. Our state legislature, the state senate, is 23-10. Republican. The state house is 65-34 Republican. So you might say, well, Herb, how can you say this is a balanced political state? And one way I can say that is you actually look at vote totals, meaning the number of votes cast. You know, if you look, for example, in 2014, we elected 12 out of 16 members of the House as Republicans. If you added up the popular vote across all 16 of those districts, it was about 50-50. Which really demonstrates that it's good to control the drawing of the district lines. And the Republicans certainly did it to the Democrats, but let me tell you, if the Democrats had a chance to do it to the Republicans in Ohio, they would do it in a second. There's no such thing as fairness and generosity when you have partisan redistricting. And again, if you look at the presidential results in Ohio, Al Gore lost by 3 points. The last polls were saying he was going to lose by 10. He lost by 3 in Ohio. George Bush narrowly beat John Kerry. And then Barack Obama won Ohio twice. But he won it by smaller margins than he won states like Illinois, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. Ohio is a tougher nut to crack for Democrats. But if they win Ohio, that oftentimes indicates they're going to be doing well in the other Great Lakes states. Now, in the primary, the Republican primary this year, John Kasich actually did win his home state, unlike Marco Rubio. And that's important because, in fact, that was really the end of the Rubio campaign. And Kasich won by a margin of about 11%. And so, didn't get 50% of the vote because there are other candidates besides him and Trump in the race. But if you actually look at the returns, and you look at eastern Ohio, and you go like from, let's say, from Youngstown all the way down the Ohio River, and now you're getting into Appalachia, Donald Trump carried all of those counties. And as a lot of people have said about Donald Trump, he has appealed to people who feel that the political system, the economic system, has let them down, has failed them, has betrayed them, or whatever. And I think it's certainly possible. And the latest polls we have in Ohio have Hillary and Donald tied at 40-40. And that might suggest here that Trump will actually do reasonably well among these voters in the coal mining areas, a lot of them former Democrats perhaps, and who, when he says, you have been left behind by a rigged, unfair system, vote for me, and I'll create thousands and thousands of jobs, that appeal may in fact work to some extent. So you may see traditional battle lines in Ohio changing. At the same time, if you talk to suburban, educated, white women, Republicans in Ohio, a lot of them, by no means a majority, but quite a number of them are saying, I can't do it. I can't bring myself to vote for Trump. And some are saying, well, I'm going to vote for Hillary. But don't tell my precinct captain, in a neighborhood or whatever. But probably some of those precinct captains, if they're women, may in fact be voting for Hillary. So we may in fact have here a very, very competitive race in Ohio, but in fact it may not be the traditional kinds of voting patterns. One of the things that people talk about is that there's a gender gap, and Democrats run much better among women than Republicans do. And of course, you could say it the opposite way. You could say the gender gap is the fact that Republicans run much better among men than Democrats do. You could say it both ways. But the gender gap's a little misleading, because when Democrats like Barack Obama carried the female vote largely because they won the non-white female vote by overwhelming margins. And so when you added the non-white and the white female vote together, the Democrats actually carried the female vote. But when you look simply at the white female vote, Mitt Romney carried that vote. And he carried it by a decent margin. And so one of the challenges here, and I think this is something that I think the Trump campaign has to worry about, I've now seen some polls where Hillary is winning the white female vote. And if she wins the white female vote, and then of course runs huge margins on the non-white female vote, that probably is going to lead to a fairly strong election victory for her, unless Trump's support among white males far exceeds what Mitt Romney accomplished, 4 years ago. And there's some evidence that, in fact, Donald Trump has attracted voters either who had not participated before, or some white male voters who you might say would be really leaning toward the Democrats, but in fact are going to go for Trump. So I think a lot of these things are going to play out in Ohio. They'll play out in Pennsylvania also, because Pennsylvania is a state, particularly the western and southwestern part of the state, that has actually gone through also severe economic dislocations. So I think we're going to see here in Ohio and Pennsylvania, these two states being key battleground states. California, no. New York, Trump says, well, I can play in New York. I don't think so. Texas, I don't think the Democrats this year have a chance in Texas. Democrats are saying, well, but maybe this year we can bring Arizona into play. And of course, that's under the assumption of what? That's under the assumption that the Hispanic vote that's not registered will register, and that the Hispanic vote will turn out at a very high rate. But the flip side of that are all the white citizens of Arizona who face some of the border issues and who might in fact find that Donald Trump really is saying what they really believe. And so again, Trump might do better among white Arizonans than Mitt Romney did. People are joking, and it probably can't happen, but they're joking that Hillary might try to compete in Utah, the most Republican state in the country, but also the most Mormon state in its voting patterns. And of all the states in which Donald Trump ran this year, in the primaries, he ran the worst in Utah because many people of the Mormon faith found him totally unacceptable on multiple grounds. And there actually are some polls in Utah right now saying it's highly competitive. And perhaps if Mitt Romney were to endorse Hillary Clinton, I don't think he would do that. Now, we would like to invite you all back to Cleveland in a few weeks to attend Housing's Under Own, and there's no per diem or anything like that. But nobody's really quite sure of how that convention will unfold. And that becomes very, very critical. Because when a party has a highly divisive convention, that's a bad way to start a general election. But I'm not sure, despite all the talk that's going on right now, there's still a delegate movement out there. There's probably 10 to 15% of the delegates who are saying, let's pass a rule at the Republican convention that says delegates are allowed to vote their conscience as a way of trying to stop Trump. I don't think that's going to happen. And my scenario is that Donald Trump will actually surprise a lot of people. This would be the recommendation I make, so every time I make a recommendation publicly, he proves me entirely wrong. So, but he should deliver a speech that talks about his key themes and drops all the references to Mexicans and Muslims and things. Just stop that already. Besides being offensive, which it is, he does reinforce the fact that we may elect a bigot, and if he's not a bigot, then he's the most cynical politician in the world. We may elect a bigot as president of the United States. That's not exactly something that I, as a political science professor teaching, find that to be a fun thing to even have to address or whatever. But I hope that he will in fact give the speeches. A lot of the things he says, if you can separate them out from all the other baggage, when he says that our allies should pay more for the cost of their own defense, that makes sense to me. When he starts talking about NATO, and sort of trashing NATO, I'm thinking, oh my God, Putin is going to vote for you. When he cheers what's happening in in Great Britain now, and you can make arguments both ways now, but the fact that probably the happiest person about the outcome in Britain, again, is Putin. Anything that actually weakens Europe or divides Europe, says to Putin, well, we got part of Crimea, let's see if we can get Estonia. No, serious. The West is a little too weak, and they're more divided and all of that. And Trump just seems to be, and when he said that, well, you know, Japan and South Korea, maybe they should go nuclear.
Oh.
I do predict that after the conventions you are going to see, this may not help Hillary, but the Republican-dominated foreign policy and defense establishment will endorse her. And Trump will simply say, look, that's the establishment again, look what they got us. So who knows whether that'll, but at some point you hope that people will start thinking about some of these things. But again, going back to the Republican convention, Trump actually has a lot of things that he can put together that actually make some sense. And if he now says that, you know, we can't have these bad trade deals, you know, that makes more sense. And again, that's a vulnerability of Bill Clinton, and by association, you know, Hillary Clinton. And in states like Pennsylvania and Ohio, you've seen the good and the bad about these trade agreements. And so when somebody tells you, well, the trade agreements overall generated wealth in the United States, and maybe even generated jobs, that's not the way it translated or turned out at the local level or the regional level. In Ohio, there are whole industries that were wiped out. Pottery industries that we had are gone. Luckily, you know, we bailed out the auto industry, but the steel industry is gone. The coal industry is going for other reasons. And, but in fact, many of the coal miners believe, you know, we're being screwed by what? The federal government. The EPA is putting us out of business. It's all Barack Obama and his war on coal. And Donald Trump is reinforcing that point. But what I'd like you to do, if you get a chance, go and look at the Trump announcement. This was in June 14th or 16th of 2015. It was at Trump Tower in Manhattan. He was introduced by his daughter, Ivanka. She did an absolutely spectacular job. She talked about her father as a father and her father as a businessman and related his business skills to being a good president. So listen to that, and then listen to Trump's speech. And there are a few little offensive, and again, it's sort of rambling, it goes on and on. But imagine taking that speech and distilling the substantive points in that speech, and then imagine Donald Trump at the Republican convention on the night he wins the nomination, reintroducing himself to the American people. American people are not known for long memories and all of that. And all of a sudden, you could very well have Donald Trump as, oh, what were people saying about him? This is all very reasonable. Now, Donald Trump may not be willing to play the game that way, but I think everybody's telling him he should. Go look at that announcement speech, because actually it's pretty good. It's not smooth and all that. So watch the convention, or even better, go to the convention. So let's get back to Ohio, because also at stake this year is control of the U.S. Senate. And we have an absolutely critical U.S. Senate race in Ohio between the incumbent Republican Rob Portman and the former Democratic governor who lost for re-election to John Kasich, but Ted Strickland. And right now, that election is a tie in all the polls. And what's been amazing is that there have been millions and millions of dollars spent already by the campaigns, but mainly by the outside groups, either in support of a candidate, but much more common, attacking the other candidate. And there's been much more money on the Republican, pro-Republican side than on the Democratic side, but the numbers haven't moved much. I mean, it's pretty close, and it's still close or whatever. And that actually says that Ohio will not only have a presidential contest that matters, it will also have a U.S. Senate race that matters. And we'll see how that comes out. Florida, just as an aside, you probably read that Marco Rubio has changed his mind and he's now going to run for re-election. Florida has a much later filing deadline. That's why he's allowed to do that. And so despite the fact that he really had great contempt for the Senate and really wanted to get out of there, he's now doing it for the sake of the Republican majority in the Senate, and a number of the people in the Republican primary have dropped out. And so now, in fact, Rubio is the favorite, and this now will be a seat that probably Rubio will be favored to win, when up till a couple days ago, Democrats were favored to pick up that seat. But the U.S. Senate battle is going to be New Hampshire, Wisconsin, a number of other states. The U.S. House, if the Democrats won back the U.S. House, that would mean a cataclysm occurred. I mean, I think it's almost impossible. It would mean the bottom would have to fall out on the GOP. And I just don't see that happening. And in fact, one of the things that I think, as you look forward here, Brexit was an interesting development. The stock market falling quite dramatically was certainly not a pleasant development. But let's assume now that the instability that generates, plus concerns about the economy in any way, lead to an economic slowdown in the next couple of months. A major slowdown. Who benefits by that? I assume Donald Trump. And how about if we have another terrorist attack? I assume Trump benefits by that. Although I must say, Orlando, I'll try to keep my language clean. His reaction on the same day that the tragedy occurred, actually I think wound up hurting him. That was just so out of control and so vile. But still, future developments, future terrorist attacks, so, he could be the Cleveland Cavaliers. Don't tell LeBron I said that, but that's, so you're in a state right now. Yes, please.
Will you get around eventually to the libertarians?
Yes. And also to the Greens. There are some Greens, or whatever they're calling themselves, who hope Bernie will be their vice presidential nominee. That would be the definition of mischief. But Bernie's loyalty to the Democratic Party, I mean, it goes back at least 3 months. Let's imagine now that we have a Republican voter, and I call myself a Democrat. I'm a liberal on certain things, moderate on others, and personally I want Hillary to win. I thought the most qualified candidate running on the Republican side was our own governor in Ohio, John Kasich. He actually made me proud of the process. He was actually talking about issues and talking about that dirty word compromise and reaching across the aisle. Oh my God, that was, and I just thought, and then when he was in Congress back in the 1990s, he did that. And he's a good conservative. He's a principled conservative. And typically, this is the mainstream media, not the wackos on the left or right. A lot of the mainstream media, like in the Washington Post, said, well, Kasich's just talking about the issues and about making government work. and that was the tone. Nobody's interested in that. He's not giving people the red meat that they want. And I thought, oh my God, this is part of the problem. We'll get that. Going back to libertarians. So what is a Republican to do if they don't like Donald Trump? And they don't like Hillary Clinton? Okay. How does a Republican, well, one thing you can do is go out and vote straight Republican and ignore the presidential race. You can do that. And that won't, when people tabulate the votes, they'll see some people didn't vote for president, and maybe they'll interpret that as an anti-Trump statement or whatever. So that would be one choice. Another choice would be to vote for the Libertarians. And the higher the share of the vote they get, the more that might be read as, I'm disgusted with both parties. But probably the Libertarians are going to hurt Trump more than Hillary. But still, that's a statement that you could make. It's not as easily interpreted, but certainly that would be one thing to do. A third thing that I'd actually started suggesting, and I throw out wild ideas hoping something will stick, is that if a Republican is unhappy, cast a write-in vote. And if you're in Ohio and your Republican is unhappy, cast a write-in vote for John Kasich. Now, I don't know in each state how many whether the write-in votes are actually tabulated. But if you wound up seeing that 2% of the people who cast a write-in vote, that would be the best evidence of a protest. Now, as an aside, let me just finish the if the election laws were fairer, and if the media actually were on better behavior, and if in fact people actually understood what libertarians are, they would get a much higher share of the vote. I would say that on campus, this is all sort of seat of the pants estimates, I'd say if you asked our students a whole variety of issues, social issues, economic issues, the role of the government in the marketplace, the role of the government in your bedroom, that sort of thing, I'd say a good third of our students are libertarians. They'd say, government, stay out of my private life. Government, stop getting into all these things that you're regulating everything. But there's no real meaningful choice for them. There is a libertarian choice, but it doesn't get a lot of information, a lot of coverage, and all of that. And so, in fact, they'll vote. If the social issues are more important, they'll vote Democratic. If the economic issues are more important, they'll vote Republican. But in fact, neither party satisfies them. Yes? Oh, sorry.
You mentioned the word protest, and I see perhaps that the Republican convention and the Democratic convention could be, more so the Democratic convention, a repeat of Chicago '68. And going with that, Ohio, the Ferguson factor, and that factor there, and some groups that feel they've been disenfranchised, Ohio-centered, and the Philadelphia one with Bernie Sanders coming from Pennsylvania. I know how Philadelphia is, and I can see that both conventions could wind up into a near or close to Chicago proportion, especially the Democratic convention. Do you see that at all?
Well, I don't think you rule out the possibility, but I think the point here is that both parties will do their best to avoid that image of violence and riots in the streets. I think Bernie's going to play a very, very important role there in terms of saying to his supporters, and he doesn't control his supporters in many cases, so let's be careful about that. And that both parties do not want, either within the convention or outside the convention, the very kind of thing you're talking about. Because what does that suggest? You're not ready to govern. Even if you're not responsible for all that disruption or protest or violence, it sends the wrong signal. Now, having said that, of course, Chicago was the worst because you really had a Democratic mayor who, if you remember, those who remember Mayor Daley, just cursing out everybody, But in Philadelphia, you'll have a Democratic administration, mayor and police, and you'll have them do their best to, in fact, keep the protesters away from the convention hall. But what about anything that breaks out on the floor? And of course, when you start talking about things breaking out on the floor, that's more likely to happen at the Republican convention. And so one of the things to watch right now is what happens with the rules and the platform committees of both political parties. And both political parties have learned a lesson. And the lesson is, do not debate your platform at the convention. Do it, do it earlier. And the reason you don't do it at the convention is because the damn media If you're debating, so let's assume the Republicans are debating abortion. And obviously the Republicans are a pro-life party, but there are many pro-choice Republicans. And so if they're having a debate about this, you know, there's conflict, disagreement, it may be very civilized disagreement, what are the reporters going to do? They're going to go to the most extreme pro-choice Republican, and then to the most extreme pro-life Republican, and get them to offer comments, and then all of a sudden, it looks like there's a war going on. They take legitimate debate and convert it oftentimes into division that demonstrates you're not ready to govern. And so in fact, the parties don't want to do this. So let's see what happens for both parties in the next couple of weeks, because if they can get through the platform and the rules to the discussion, that'll give a good sign. But again, the Rules Committee of the Republicans now are going to be facing a suggestion, let's put in a conscience rule. I assume it's going to get spanked down or whatever, but, and then at the Republican convention and the Democratic convention, you can't control. I mean, Cleveland has put some rules in place and distance away from the convention, and the ACLU was challenging that, and they'll get that all worked out. But both parties can control whatever groups decide to show up. So if in fact you have anti-Trump groups showing up outside the Republican convention, or you have, extreme left people showing up, or the Westboro Baptist Church, which I gather was in town the other day,
Yeah.
protesting Unitarians, was it?
No.
Pardon, was that? I think
Gay pride.
no, that was a couple of weeks ago. Oh, there was still protesting.
They were here
They missed it. They were late for the parade, so I guess I heard they were protesting the Unitarians. They were. Well, we all know those dangerous Unitarians really don't have. But I think you raise a really good question. That the potential for violence is there in both, and that could be very harmful to her. Now, I'm a little bit surprised if I were giving, the next time there are disruptors at a Trump rally, I think Hillary should make even a stronger statement. Not her aide, John Podesta, should say, this is outrageous. How dare you do that? You may not like Mr. Trump, but that's not the American way of doing it. And Trump should be saying the same thing. That would be smart politics and leadership.
Is there an advantage to the Democratic convention being after the
Yes.
Republican?
Yes, and the one advantage, and here I'm going to throw out another wild idea, of course, is you'll know who the Republican ticket is. And you'll know what kind of convention the Republicans had. I mean, if the Republicans have a disastrous convention, actually that won't be all that good for Democrats, because then Democrats will think, oh, we don't have to be disciplined. We can do what the Republicans did. But they'll know who the ticket is. And here's an idea. I mean, it's not, people laugh at me, but, oh, you got a good vice president now. Keep him in place, Clinton Biden would be the oldest ticket, but talk about stability, reassurance, and all of that. And, quick.
Could you comment on the super delegates and if there's any chance they're going to be eliminated?
It may be changed. Let me talk about this. Bernie and his supporters, in some ways, are the biggest hypocrites in the world. And the reason I say that is the anti-democratic rules that seem to hurt them, that certainly would be the superdelegates, well, they hate those. But the things that really help them, such as caucuses, let me tell you, caucus is one of the most undemocratic things. Who can afford to go to a caucus and spend hours? Well, college students who in fact have lots of freedom in their schedule. And what kind of participation rate do you get in a caucus versus a primary? It's a tiny participation rate. So I thought, Bernie, you're being a little too sanctimonious here. But the reason we have superdelegates on the Democratic side, and it goes back to the 1968 convention when Herbert Humphrey won the nomination without entering a single primary. So Democrats reformed the process and they wound up encouraging states to have primaries. And so with their new process, in 1972, their front-runner, Edmund Muskie, fell, and the nomination was won by George McGovern. And they all knew George McGovern was going to be a disaster, and he was as a candidate. He carried one state, and people thought, ooh, primaries aren't all that good either, and caucuses. So let's get some people at the convention who actually would know the candidates. So it's not going to be like governors picking their own delegations, which they used to happen. It'd be, let's have a certain percentage of the delegates who are party officials and party leaders. And in fact, they have their own independent judgment. And so Bernie was really complaining about that. How dare they have that? Bernie also was fortunate in that the Democrats back then adopted rules of proportionality. So that when Hillary won Ohio, she didn't get all the votes. When she won New York, she didn't get all the delegates. It wasn't winner take all. And, Republicans had a mix of winner take all and proportionality. So a lot of this is really sort of self-serving complaining. And by the end of the process, there was Bernie wooing the superdelegates. But your point, and I won't be that so long-winded on all the questions, I think you're right that there will be some changes made to that. And it gets into reducing the number, for example. Yes? Make sure I do this in order so I don't, if somebody's had their hand up for a while. Yeah, okay, please.
I think there's going to be a very high voter unpredictability factor in this election that pollsters may not be able to quantify, because you're going to have voters who are registered in parties other than Republican or Democrat, which you talked about, how are they going to vote? You've got Republicans who may vote for Hillary, but they're not going to admit that to anybody until they get into the polling booth. You've got Republicans who aren't going to vote for either candidate. They can't bring themselves to vote for Hillary, so they'll stay home. Then you'll have people who are not registered in either party or any party. They may stay home because they can't bring themselves to vote for either candidate. So this has got to be driving the pollsters crazy. How are they going to quantify this?
Well, pollsters have lots of other problems in addition to all that. I just finished, I'm not plugging it, but I just finished the 9th edition of my book on public opinion polling. And the title is called Polling in the Public, What Every Citizen Should Know. And it's not just about election polling, because everybody is using polls to convince you of something. And the election polls are the ones that we're most familiar with, and they're one of the few kinds of polls where there is some sort of metric that you can compare the poll result to the election outcome. Most other polls don't have it. So everything you said is true. I don't think there'll be a lot of Republicans, I'll just quibble on one little thing first. There won't be a lot of Republicans who stay home because they don't like Hillary. Because I think the party's going to do a really good job of reminding Republican voters that you've got U.S. Senate, you've got State House, State Senate, U.S. Reps, you have all that. So I think probably you'll find here that won't be, but still, everything else you said here, first of all, I wouldn't believe any polls right now. Wait until after the conventions, when you know that Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton are the nominees and the country has had a chance to see both of them again, then look and call that the baseline. Okay, but then from there, one of the real challenges that pollsters have is how do you ascertain who's going to vote? You have these likely voter models. If you screw up on that, let me give you an example. And Gallup had the problem in 2012. I was talking to friends of mine who are really very talented in politics and polling, and they were absolutely confident of two things. Number one, Mitt Romney was going to carry Ohio. That they were absolutely sure. And they were very confident that he was going to win the election. And they were all flying up to Boston for the victory statement. And if you remember that night, it took a while for the Romney campaign to do the concession. And And that was because they were not ready to, they thought they were going to win. And why did they think that? Because the pollsters, and these were good pollsters, and these were polls done right up to election day. Because one of the problems you have with polls, if you stop too early, who knows what could happen over the last weekend? They got it wrong. Now, how did they get it wrong? Well, they did not believe in their polling data that the turnout among minority voters and young voters would be as high as it was. And of course, typically we think of minority and younger voters as not turning out as high a rate. But what kind of ground operation and field operation the Obama campaign had? Had a tremendous field operation. The polls didn't capture it. The polls didn't really capture in those states where you had early voting, like Ohio. We can now vote 35 days before the election. I mean, that gives both parties the opportunity to use the term they use is have a lot of votes in the bank by the time election day rolls around. No, you're absolutely right. So don't get overly depressed by the polls if they're not going in your direction. But the simple advice would be, if there are lots of polls out there, take a mental average of them. One last point on that, then we'll go there and then there. Let's see. Donald Trump, and again, this is not too strong a pattern, but Donald Trump seems to have been running better in polls that are done, the automatic, the telephone call where it's not a live pollster, but he seems to be doing better in those, and also in internet polls where you as the respondent have anonymity. And it may indeed be the case that maybe some people who in fact want to vote for Trump know that they may be frowned upon or whatever, but if they have anonymity, they might be more likely to say it. But maybe the traditional pollsters are underestimating Donald Trump's strength. Yes?
This may be the last question because of the time limits and the schedule, but I'll pass it back, and then I'm sure Herbert will be around.
Yeah, and we had two people waiting, so I'll give a short answer. I promise.
Okay.
I never keep my promise.
I was part of the groups with the Democrats making phone calls during the 2012 election. And a lot of people had cell phones and we were unable to reach them.
Yep.
And so that was an issue. And I wonder, because so many, and you were mentioning the internet and the anonymity, but how many young people are not being counted because they're just unreachable?
Yeah. Cell phones are a major problem. The major polling outfits now realize they have to do a lot more work, in fact, in trying to build their samples. How many of you still have landlines? If you came to one of my classes and watched me ask the question, inevitably, first some students say, what's a landline? What's a landline? And so you're exactly right. That cell phones have created challenges. Also, more and more people not wanting to respond to pollsters because there's such a glut of these damn telemarketing calls and all of that. So that's another challenge. Last question.
I think one of the interesting challenges for the Republican Party this year that is most unusual is fundraising. And Donald Trump's inability or unwillingness to help the rest of the party in fundraising. And the Koch brothers refusing to support the Republican convention. I've never seen this. And it'll be interesting to see what happens when Donald Trump does or does not put a whole bunch of his own money in that. And then it doesn't help the rest of the Republican candidates.
You know, you sort of give me a high-hanging curveball. And I could let it just stand there and take it for a call third strike and we could be finished. But I think the money will eventually find its way there. But, and I don't mean this to sound too nasty or cruel to Donald Trump, but if Donald Trump starts, quote unquote, funding his own campaign in a meaningful way, more likely what will happen is he will lend the campaign, he will loan money to his campaign. And so the first dollars that come in will be to pay back the loans. And if you actually look right now, and a little longer comment.
Absolutely.
It was a shame that his Republican opponents did not actually do the research on Donald Trump's business dealings and background. It was a shame the media did not do that. And so now it's coming out, and one of the things coming out is that a lot of the fact the money they've raised already has been spent with vendors in which Donald Trump actually profits by the spending. But that's not the, we'll see. But I think the money will be there. Well, thank you. It is always funny to be with a mature audience. Thank you. Go to Confest.
I'm sure that Herbert can stick around for a few minutes. If anybody has some questions, they can come forward. Lunch is in the Fusion Room. Motor coaches downstairs.